Hello again, Blender heads. Jamie from Dragon Boot Studios here, and today we're going to be tackling part 2 of the Sculpting Lapras series. In the first video I did a speed sculpt of Lapras. I'll make sure that there is a link to the video in the description below if you've missed that. In this lesson we'll be texture painting and setting up our materials for Lapras here. Now a big part of that will be extracting displacement maps and cavity maps from our detailed sculpt so we can then apply them to a lower polygon model. Now, if you're planning on just sculpting your character, these steps aren't entirely necessary, but if you want to rig and animate it later, these steps are kind of absolutely necessary. You wouldn't be able to animate Lapras here with all of this high polygon detail that we've got in the multi-res modifier, so we have to extract it. The first thing that we need to do if we want to extract these maps is to UV unwrap her. We have to have somewhere to store the displacement map or normal map data, and for that, she has to have UVs. The spikes on the shell here give me quite a bit of trouble. Because they're poking out of the mesh, they stretch the UVs quite a bit. I try using the minimize stretch tool, but ironically, in this case it actually stretches the UVs even more. I try cutting off the spikes and unwrapping them separately, and although this gives me some better results, it's still not as good as I would like. In the end, I just go with a straight normal unwrap, followed by scaling the centers of the spikes with a proportional editing tool, and this gives me the best results. Lapras is fairly simple to unwrap. I want to separate the major parts such as the head and the flippers from the torso. Then I want to split the flippers down the middle so that I can unwrap them flat. I choose to add this cut on the underside of the flipper, where you're less likely to see if any seams occur. I also separate the horns as they're pretty tricky to unwrap and I want to work on them separately. Similar to the flippers, I add a seam down the back of the spine. Usually I'd be doing this on the underbelly like we did with the flippers, but since Lapras has this massive shell on the back, I can actually use it to hide any seams down the back. I do an initial test unwrap to see how well I've set up all of my seams. I can immediately see that there's one UV island here that's kind of folding in on itself. Looking closely, I can see that this is the inside of the mouth, which is where I've forgotten to add a seam down the middle so it'll flatten out properly. Same deal with the horns, they're kind of wrapping in on each other. They need an extra seam running down their middle as well. While I'm unwrapping these, I also realize that there's some geometry that's interpenetrating kind of inside the head there. So I quickly smooth this out a little bit, as I know that if you've got geometry that's intersecting with itself, it can kind of mess up your displacement maps later on. After I apply the checkered texture, you can see that I'm still getting quite a lot of stretching around the face and the nose. This isn't unusual for characters with these kind of larger snouts. It's fairly easy to fix just by cutting the seam a little bit further down the face and re-unwrapping it. I like to lay out my UVs in a kind of mirrored pose. This isn't strictly speaking necessary, and it can sometimes give your UVs a little bit less space, but it does make it a lot easier to just kind of look at the UV map and immediately tell which islands are which, and this can save a lot of time when painting your textures. And now we're finally up to the part where we can extract our displacement maps. Firstly, we need to create an image texture. Blender needs this so that it has somewhere to save the displacement data that we extract. When I create my maps, I like to have them pretty big, 4K in this case. Displacement maps need to have a lot of data stored in them, so although you can get away with just like using normal textures, JPEGs, PNGs, whatever, it's definitely worthwhile to check the 32-bit box. This allows the texture to save stacks more detail in them. To get the displacement or normal map options, tick the Bake from Multi-Res option. This reduces all the different options in your bake type options so that you've only got normal and displacement map to choose from. The way displacement maps are calculated is by comparing two different meshes. So Blender will compare the base model to the high resolution sculpted details, and then it creates a black and white map where they differ. So white areas are where details are kind of pushed out, such as the spots, and black areas are where details is pushed in, like in the wrinkles. Now I realize that this is all a little bit of a tricky process. Like I say, it's not too bad once you've kind of wrapped your head around it and done it a couple of times, but it's tricky the first couple of times. So let me know in the comments below if you'd like to see a step-by-step real-time tutorial on how to set all of this up. Now that we've got our displacement maps sorted, I want to add some extra detail maps to use as part of painting our color or diffuse maps. In other programs, these are usually referred to as cavity maps. In Blender, we use the pointiness setting of the geometry node to create these cavity maps. This looks at our high detailed sculpt and paints black areas in all the little crevices or cavities, hence the name cavity map, and it leaves the areas with less detail white. Now currently the pointiness feature here is only available in cycles, which means to view it we actually need to be in rendered mode. We can't actually see it if we're just in material mode. We can, however, bake this map out, which is what we're going to do, like we did with our displacement maps, which then allows us to use this map in Eevee. I use a color ramp to dial in where I want my dark and light areas to be. Once I'm happy, as we did before, we need to create another image texture to be able to save our data into. Now in this case, we don't need to have all that extra detail that we had with the displacement maps, so we can disable the 32-bit option. Once I have this map baked, I can combine it with a mix node and set it to multiply to add some darker areas to our texture. With the body all set up and finished, I turn to the shell. Now it's worth mentioning that to get the pointiness details to work, you really need to have your multi-res modifier still enabled. The pointiness detail works with the geometry that's actually in your scene, so it won't pick up these details if you're just using a displacement map. You have to have the multi-res still here. Now, please remember that none of the maps that we've created are saved by default. You have to remember to save them manually, or when you close Blender, you can lose all of them and you'd have to do all of this work again. With my maps extracted successfully, I save a new copy of my scene before deleting the multi-res modifiers. I don't need them anymore now that we've baked our displacement maps, but it's still a really good idea to save a backup copy with the multi-res still there, just in case you need to come back and fix something. Always save backups. Now, when saving out your displacement maps, remember that they are 32-bit images, which means that they can't be saved as just a JPEG or a PNG. JPEGs don't support that kind of detail, so you want to save them as either a TIFF, a Targa, or an OpenEXR. In this case, I choose TIFFs, but the others would work equally well. The cavity or pointiness maps can be saved as just normal JPEGs or PNGs. They don't need that extra detail. Okay, that concludes the more technical part of the video. Now I'm up to the part where I can just kind of paint color onto the model. Like we did with our other maps, we still need to create a new image texture to be able to paint this detail into. I spent a bit of time setting up my brush here, choosing a texture to add a little bit of random to my painting, adding a little bit of jitter to the brush, again just adding a little bit more random. Painting on a closed mouth can be a little bit tricky as the paint tends to kind of get projected onto both the top and bottom lips. In fact, you can't see it here, but later on, after I finished recording the video, I was playing around with opening the mouth and I realized that the inside of the mouth, the bottom lip, there's kind of this straight line of that light brown on the inside of the lips, and it looks really unnatural. Thankfully, you can choose to paint on your texture map rather than painting on the model, which makes cleaning up this stuff much, much easier. Alternatively, you could add a temporary key shape to open the mouth, which would allow you to paint on the inside of it, and then afterwards you can just delete the key shape. It's really worth creating palettes of color when you paint. It allows you to come back and pick exactly the same color that you were using before. For more cartoony characters like this, palettes can be really, really useful. To paint the shell, I choose a more rocky type texture to add the extra detail. Here I'm just painting some lighter and darker areas, the idea being that the higher parts of the mesh would be exposed to more sunlight and they'd get baked a little bit in the sun, while the lower areas would get less sunlight and be more likely to collect dirt, making them darker. It's always worth thinking about why your textures are the way that they are. The texture should sort of tell its own story, just as much as like the character or animation can. Painting on the underside of the shell here probably isn't completely necessary, nobody's ever going to see it, but I just can't help myself, and I do it for the sake of completeness. I quickly jump back to the body to paint in a few extra little dirt details, such as near the base of the shell and inside the wrinkles. Again, I feel this strange desire to paint everything under the shell too. It's not entirely necessary, but again, I just kind of can't help myself. I can't quite get the paint to work on the inside of the nose here, so I jump over to the texture map itself and paint in the parts that I can't quite seem to reach. Now remember, because you're painting on the map and not on your model, symmetry no longer works, so you will have to paint both sides to get both nostrils. I also take this time to clean up the inside of the mouth a little bit. Finally, I wanted to do a little experiment and deviate from the original design a little bit, and I choose to make the horn on the head kind of like the spikes on the shell, the idea being that both the shell and the horns would be made from bone, kind of like a rhino horn. I also experimented doing this with the horns on the side of the head, but it just felt that deviated from the original design a little too much. I struggled to get the paint to work just the way I wanted to here. This is somewhat because this was a last-minute decision. Ideally, I probably would have added some extra kind of rough lines between the normal skin and the horn in the sculpted detail, and just sort of give myself a little bit of a break line where the skin becomes horn. Finally, I'm finished with the texturing and I go into the shading editor to play with the materials a little bit. Firstly, I already know that I want to add a little bit of subsurface scattering to make the material look a little bit more like skin. At the moment it just looks a little bit plasticky. To achieve this, I take the diffuse map that we've already painted and I put it through a couple of color nodes such as hue and saturation to make it a little bit more red. This gives the impression of there being blood under the skin and makes the subsurface scattering look more realistic. I wasn't happy with the cartoony eye that I made earlier. It was clashing with this now more realistic sculpt that I've made. So I jump into Photoshop and I grab an eye texture that I have in my library. With a bit of masking and color correcting, I add all this extra iris detail to the eye. I also add a little bit of bump map detail to the iris. This will barely be visible in the final render, but it just kind of breaks up the reflections a little bit. I also take this opportunity to create a glassy membrane for the eyes. You really need both the eyeball and this glassy covering to make eyes look right. There's a way that the glassy component reflects and refracts light that just doesn't quite look right unless you have it in there. As a final bit of detail, I choose to add a bump map to both the body and the shell. I found that using a Musgrave texture here can give this kind of subtle appearance of there being water on the skin, which I really liked. Now this detail only needs to be very, very subtle, as our sculpt already has most of the details we need in it. While playing with the shell, I realize I can crank up the Musgrave texture, and I can use it to kind of take chunks out of the shell, kind of like it's been damaged at some point. This was a little bit of a happy accident, but I choose to go with it. And that's it for the texturing. In the next lesson, I'll show you how to quickly build a rig for Lapras so we can pose it for a final render. We'll also go over some lighting stuff as well as building a base for Lapras to sit on. I'll see you in the next video real soon.